Hola a todos y todas, muy buenos días, egunon. Es un verdadero placer daros la bienvenida a CIME 2026 y agradeceros vuestra presencia en esta nueva edición del Congreso Internacional Multidisciplinar de Investigación Educativa. Este año tenemos además la suerte de encontrarnos en un lugar muy especial, el Palacio de Euskalduna, uno de los edificios más emblemáticos de Bilbao. Este auditorio es la sede, o suele ser la sede de la temporada de ópera de la ciudad y un referente cultural internacional. Esperamos que durante estos días, además, este espacio sea también un escenario de diálogo, que podamos compartir conocimientos y, pues, ¿por qué no?, nuevas colaboraciones entre todas las personas aquí asistentes, ¿no?, con el compromiso de, por una educación pues, basada en la investigación y en el impacto social. Para comenzar este acto inaugural, me gustaría dar la palabra a dos personas, que las tenemos aquí, representantes de la Asociación Multidisciplinar de Investigación Educativa de AMIE. En primer lugar, a Esther Roca, profesora de la Universidad de Valencia y presidenta de AMIE, y junto a ella a Miquel Pérez, profesor de la Universidad de Cantabria y vocal de AMIE. Pero antes vamos a escuchar a dos personas tituladas por conservatorio. Anne, que actúa en la Orquesta de Mujeres de Euskadi, de aquí, y Garasi en el coro de óperas en el Liceu y en otros teatros. Van a introducirnos, como no, la canción Chori a Chori. Así que os dejamos con ellos.
Egoak ebaki banizkio, neria izango zen, ez zuen alde egingo. Egoak ebaki banizkio, neria izango zen, ez zuen alde egingo. Baina nonela, ezen gehiago txoria izango. Baina nonela, ezen gehiago txoria izango. Eta nik txoria nuen maite, eta nik txoria nuen maite.
Muchísimas gracias, Anne y Garasi, por ayudarnos a entrar de una forma bonita en este congreso desde el primer momento. Nosotros, tanto Miquel como yo, teníamos unas palabras de apertura y sobre todo para impulsar que tengamos 2 días intensos, pero que los disfrutemos muchísimo. Chori a Chori es un auténtico himno popular de libertad. Es una canción profundamente vinculada a esta tierra que nos recuerda que si le hubiéramos cortado las alas ya no sería pájaro. Tal vez esa imagen nos ayude a comprender el verdadero sentido de la educación y también de la investigación educativa. De qué manera lo que aquí debatimos, investigamos y compartimos contribuye a dar alas a las personas, a nuestras sociedades. Cómo logramos que el conocimiento que generamos amplíe libertades, abra oportunidades y permita a cada persona desarrollar plenamente sus capacidades.
El lema de esta edición, El sueño era posible, ahora es real, nos invita precisamente a mirar con perspectiva el camino recorrido por la investigación educativa. Durante años soñamos con una educación más inclusiva, más democrática y capaz de responder a los grandes desafíos sociales de nuestro tiempo. Soñamos con que las evidencias científicas pudieran orientar las políticas educativas, mejorar las prácticas docentes y contribuir a construir sociedades más justas. Hoy, muchas de las investigaciones que se presentan en este congreso nos muestran que ese sueño no era una utopía. Allí donde el conocimiento científico se ha unido al compromiso de docentes, estudiantes, familias, comunidades e instituciones, se han producido transformaciones reales y medibles.
La investigación educativa, pensamos, alcanza su máximo valor cuando mejora la vida de las personas y precisamente por ello CIME ocupa un lugar singular en el panorama científico internacional. Desde que se creó en 2011 y que muchas personas estábamos ya allí, este congreso ha contribuido a hacer posible ese sueño, consolidándose como un espacio de referencia para quienes entienden que la excelencia científica y el impacto social no son objetivos contrapuestos, sino inseparables. Año tras año, alrededor de 500 investigadores e investigadoras de más de un centenar de universidades nos reunimos aquí para compartir evidencias, debatir resultados y avanzar en la construcción colectiva de conocimiento orientado a la transformación social. Las personas y las sociedades necesitan y merecen mejoras de resultados educativos. Este congreso anual destaca por aportar evidencias científicas que lo logran, incluso en los contextos donde en otros congresos se afirma que eso era imposible. Las diversas ciencias que trabajamos en educación para lograr el reconocimiento y recursos que merecen tienen que lograr demostrar que contribuyen a esas mejoras y este congreso anual lo está demostrando y ayuda a que eso suceda. Para lograr el avance que necesitamos en nuestras carreras profesionales, tenemos también que lograr hacer investigaciones que se publiquen en revistas indexadas y este congreso anual lo está consiguiendo en una proporción creciente y muy superior a otros espacios y congresos. CIME ha sido también pionero en Europa al situar el impacto social de la investigación educativa en el centro del debate científico. Mucho antes de que este tema ocupara un lugar destacado en las agendas de investigación y que todos recibimos, ¿no?, ahora este impacto, este congreso ya impulsaba el análisis de cómo el conocimiento científico puede generarse y desarrollarse junto a la ciudadanía, incorporando especialmente las voces de quienes tradicionalmente han estado más alejados de los espacios de producción científica. Basta recorrer los programas de las diferentes ediciones, y que los tenemos publicados en la web, para comprobar cómo esta apuesta ha ido creciendo hasta convertirse en una de sus señas de identidad. También CIME fue precursor en la creación desde los primeros momentos de una comisión Violencia Cero y en la defensa de espacios académicos libres de violencia, promoviendo el rechazo tanto a la violencia directa que sufrimos las personas como de la violencia aisladora y contribuyendo a generar entornos científicos que fueran seguros, éticos, democráticos y valientes en el estudio y análisis de estas temáticas.
El programa de esta edición refleja, además, la extraordinaria vitalidad de la investigación educativa actual. Nos acompañan referentes internacionales que nos ayudarán a pensar algunos de los grandes desafíos de nuestro tiempo. Hoy tendremos el privilegio de escuchar a Dragan Abramov, referente en políticas educativas. Junto a ello, los paneles nos invitan a reflexionar sobre cuestiones tan relevantes como el papel de la educación musical en la transformación social, las oportunidades y desafíos que plantean la inteligencia artificial, las redes sociales y la producción colaborativa del conocimiento o el impacto que estos fenómenos tienen en las nuevas generaciones. Mañana, la conferencia de clausura de Sari Hanafi nos adentrará en la importancia del diálogo como herramienta para superar la polarización y construir sociedades más democráticas. Y lo hará tras un día de diálogo con temas tan urgentes como la prevención del abuso sexual infantil, el multilingüismo y la superación del racismo, o la incorporación de un nuevo ámbito que simboliza muy bien la capacidad de la educación para responder a los desafíos sociales contemporáneos, la educación para la salud. Por eso, al inaugurar esta ya nueva edición en Bilbao, ciudad que ha sabido reinventarse sin renunciar a su identidad, podemos afirmar que el sueño al que alude nuestro lema no pertenece únicamente al pasado. Todas estas contribuciones, desde perspectivas muy diversas, comparten una misma aspiración: comprender mejor nuestro mundo para ampliar las oportunidades de las personas y de las comunidades. En definitiva, contribuir a que la educación siga dando alas allí donde todavía existen barreras que superar.
Y bueno, con este sueño damos así inaugurada la 14ª edición de nuestro CIME y para nosotros y nosotras es un honor poderlo compartirlo con todos vosotros y vosotras. Muchas gracias.
Eskerrik asko, Esther, eskerrik asko, Miquel. Continuamos ahora con la conferencia inaugural de este congreso, como bien ha dicho Miquel. Es un honor presentar a Dragana Abramov, directora e investigadora científica principal de Population and Social Policy Consultant. Desde 1999 trabaja como experta independiente para la Comisión Europea, en la evaluación de propuestas de proyectos y en el análisis de políticas, así como en calidad de observadora independiente para la Comisión Europea. Su investigación se centra en las dimensiones sociales de la educación, la gestión de la migración y la integración de los inmigrantes, el impacto social de la investigación y la ética. Es un privilegio contar hoy con su presencia en CIME. Dragana, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Cuando quieras. Thank you very much. Dragana, the floor is yours.
Buenos días. I first of all have to apologize for not speaking Spanish in Spain. I will be using what has become a lingua franca in Europe today, but I can assure you that English is not my mother tongue either, so that should be a solid basis for good understanding. Also, I want to underline that virtual conferences like the one I'm participating in today from Brussels lack an essential ingredient, speakers' feel of the audience. I cannot adapt to the room because I cannot sense to what extent you are finding interesting what I'm talking about, and at what point I will start losing your attention. Unless, of course, you start hooting, booing, whistling. Let's hope not to go that way. So let's start with the first key word from the title of today's presentation. And the presentation addresses present and future educational policies in Europe. A point of clarification right away. When we refer to Europe nowadays, we neither mean Europe as a continent nor as a geopolitical notion of Europe, but rather we refer to the European Union as an economic and political union on 27 member states that share common policies, institutions, and a single market. That is going to be my reference unit today, simply because already 27 countries with quite different education frameworks sharing more or less general education policy directions is already large in scope and scale. Obviously, present policies are largely shaped by the past choices. This year, in February 2026, we have reached a 50-year milestone, half a century of the European Union's education policy. Shared policy officially began in February 1976, when the Council of Ministers adopted the first Education Action Programme. If we look backward, we see that it took from 1957, the Treaty of Rome, to the Education Action Programme, for the member states to agree that a common market may require some harmonization of training. Indeed, the initial 1976 framework focused predominantly on vocational training, language learning, and improving educational opportunities for migrant workers. I will obviously not dwell today on the development of the legal basis for EU-wide educational cooperation. I will just mention that it was formally established in the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. Education policy is governed by Article 165 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, which empowers the EU to support and supplement national education systems without replacing them. If we look backward, it has been quite a bumpy road over the past 5 decades to fully embracing also the quality, equity, and inclusion aspects, as one of the prior priorities among the 5 education strategic priority pillars. The good news for researchers is that the policy prioritization did go hand in hand with the provision of funding. Indeed, the ongoing EU research framework program spanning from 2021 to 2027, Horizon Europe, is the world's largest transnational research and innovation funding program, with an earmarked budget of over 95 billion. Social sciences and humanities in general, and education research in particular, receive a relatively small proportion of the budget. But it is a substantial and significant opportunity for our research to make a difference in society. The European education area does not have a single dedicated standard budget, but Erasmus+, the flagship EU program for education, training, youth and sport, has an indicative budget of 26.2 billion for the 21-27 period. Obviously, this budget, the funding is conditioned upon expectations from the funding agencies. Their expectations shape the scope, scale, and focus of our research. So let's have a look at present expectations towards the research and education area in Europe. The European Union's core education priorities are driven by the strategic framework for European education area. This framework targets structural development through 2030, anchored by a new Union of Skills agenda and the deployment of targeted policy actions like the education package. The primary high priority lists guiding EU education policies are structured into thematic pillars and concrete statistical targets. The EU concentrates its funding and therefore expectations towards research primarily via the Erasmus and the Horizon programs for the 5 strategic priority pillars. They are quality, equity, inclusion. The aim is guaranteeing high quality, inclusive school paths to ensure success for marginalized, migrant, and disabled students. Lifelong learning and mobility is the next one, making study or training options accessible across borders at any stage of a career. The third pillar is supporting teaching professionals, raising the profile, competence, motivation, and professional development of teachers and school leaders. Reinforcing higher education by expanding alliances like the European Universities Initiative to build integrated campus network. And the fifth pillar is green and digital transitions, embedding green skills via initiatives like the Green Comp framework and boosting digital AI capabilities via the Digital Education Action Plan. Obviously, the European Commission's current agenda addresses also the newly emerging challenges, such as AI and digital literacy, rolling out the AI literacy framework and the 2030 roadmap on digital education to handle classroom tech safety. A high priority area is STEM competencies, providing intensified structural support for science, technology, engineering, and maths disciplines. Active citizenship is a prominent topic, emphasizing social cohesion, media literacy, and democratic participation. Of growing concern is screen time and well-being, investigating the impacts of excessive device usage and social media on students' mental health. I seem to have lost connection. Am I still there?
Can you hear me? It's everything.
I lost the connection for a moment. I apologize for that. You see, technology is often being perfect.
Here, everything is fine. We can hear you perfectly, but I don't know.
Okay.
You can continue if you want.
Well, there's, I think, general consensus in literature that the current education agenda, which is shaping our future policies, is sufficiently thought and properly embedded in the core EU values. However, there is less of a consensus regarding the ambition for EU-level benchmarking and setting targets. So let's very briefly look at the indicators for policy aspirations and target values. One of the indicators is early childhood education. Researchers obviously know that it is in early childhood that we trace the foundational capabilities and skills for future education. And one of the EU targets is that at least 96% of children aged 3 to primary school are covered by early childhood education. The second indicator for following the policy success is early school leaving. And the current target is that less than 9% of pupils leave education early. Tertiary education, high ambitious level, at least 45% of 25 to 34-year-olds holding a higher qualification. Regarding basic skill underachievement, the objective is that less than 15% of 15-year-olds should be lacking in reading, maths, or science by 2030. Digital literacy, less than 15% of 8th graders lacking computer and information skills. Regarding adult learning, it is at least 47% of adults participating in training annually. For vocational education as an indicator, we want at least 60% of recent graduates exposed to work-based learning. It seems to me that over years, benchmarks have been usually set at the level that has already been achieved by the heavyweight countries, and not at the level of best EU achievers. And one can go as far as to confirm that some targets have had an inbuilt mechanism for failure. Let me put forward two examples: basic skill underachievement and early school leaving indicators and targets. Regarding basic skill underachievement, as already mentioned, the target for 2030 is to have less than 15% of 15-year-olds lacking in reading, maths, and science. Yet, in 2022, according to PISA, approximately 30% of 15-year-olds failed to reach minimum basic skill in mathematics, 26% in reading, and 24% in science. This places the EU significantly off track for its 2030 target of reducing underachievement to below 15%. At present, it appears that the target is overly ambitious and unrealistic. A second example is early school leaving, that has been a formalized priority of the EU agenda for over 2 decades, originating as an EU benchmark already in the Lisbon Treaty in 2000. If we look at the timeline of major milestones, we see that the EU established its first official benchmark, aiming to reduce the early school leaving average to 10% by 2010. This target was set in 2000 by the Lisbon Strategy. In 2008, I was invited to present an expert report to the Council of Ministers at the Education Summit in Europe on early school leaving. And at that time, I provided evidence that the target was unlikely to be reached by 2010 and suggested a to-do list based on EU-level research and peer learning exercises, which included some 10 key action areas. In 2010, the 10% benchmark was not achieved, and the same target was renewed for 2020 as part of Europe 2020 strategy. The EU just made it in 2020, reaching an average of 9.9%, while still exhibiting significant between member state differences. In 2021, European education area, the Council adopted a new resolution on a strategic framework for European cooperation in education and training, setting a rather modest EU-level target to reduce the rate of early school leaving to below 9% by 2030. So what kick-started as an overly ambitious target over a 20-year period became insufficiently ambitious. To conclude, benchmarking and target setting are tricky when having to embrace diversity of education contexts. And they're even more tricky when policy aspirations do not go hand in hand with the take-up of research findings. So, based on where we are today and what current priority areas and targets are, what can we say about the second key word in the title of my presentation, the future of education policy? My expert judgment and existing comparative literature leads me to conclude that with respect to high-quality education and equity and inclusion, measured by learning outcomes, in 2020, we were not where we were hoping to be 10 years earlier. And at present, we are in many education areas off track with respect to where we hope to be in 2030. The good news is that the European Commission and member states are increasingly turning to research community for evidence. Not only evidence what does not work, but more importantly, what has proven to work for reversing negative trends. For example, the INESET, which is an expert network on economics and sociology of education, which is funded by the European Union, in 2026 was commissioned analytical reports based on scientific literature review on issues such as effective interventions for supporting teachers across career stages to prevent burnout and enhance retention, As we know, it is extremely difficult to address the shortage of teachers in most European Union countries, and we are faced with an increasing turnover and especially migration of good teachers from more challenging schools towards easier teaching environments. Another topic that is of high priority, and the report is in the pipeline, is on digital distraction in education. We are also looking at the impact of curriculum design on achievement in basic skills. Of course, the PISA results in 2022 were an alarm bell for all European countries, as it was evident that we could not explain the decline by the COVID epidemics, and the declining trends in achievement started already before COVID. Intelligent tutoring systems and adaptive learning in school education are also being addressed. We are also becoming more aware that there are much better performing countries outside the EU system, and there is a forthcoming report on learning from high-performance extra-EU systems. Flexible pathways in higher education and digital literacy programs and digital parenting practices among the reports that have been commissioned. To this long list, I can add a significant allocation of funding for the so-called policy experimentation under Erasmus+, such as AI supporting learning pathways for basic skills and for assessment of basic skills. And much attention is on addressing learning processes and not only outcomes, and on the problem-solving approach rather than individual skills such as reading or maths. So these are areas where the policy makers are turning towards the research community for some guidance, and I think they are very relevant for aspects that you will be addressing in this conference. But unlike the policy makers that often work with desirable future and aspirations, in research, we actually apply forward-looking approach and scientific methodology to discuss future of education policies. For example, regarding methodology, demography has a long tradition of projections based on scenarios. And good scenarios include hypotheses regarding the expected future, hypotheses regarding the probable future, and hypotheses regarding possible future. Additionally, we play around with a wild card, a highly unlikely hypothesis, which, if it would materialize, there would be a huge impact. So around 2010, European Commission DG for Research brought together 24 experts from various scientific disciplines to work over a 2-year period on scenarios for Europe. The work resulted in 2012 in a publication that has a rather glorious title, Global Europe 2050. We worked on one scenario, which we named Nobody Cares, where Europe is in a muddling through process. This largely covered the notion of expected future. A second scenario was named EU under threat, where Europe is faced by an economic decline and protectionist reactions. This largely covered probable future. And the third one we called EU Renaissance, where EU continues to enlarge and become stronger with more efficient innovation systems. That was the possible, the desirable future. Today, 16 years later, it does not take much thinking to conclude which scenario has actually materialized over a 10-year period. Now, an interesting thing is that in 2010, our wild card at the time was that a big EU country decides to leave the European Union. And at that time, it sounded really wild and far-fetched. We looked at what would happen if Germany would decide to leave the EU. And we calculated in all domains expected impacts. And we looked at dimensions such as global demographic and social challenges, energy and natural resources, security and efficiency, environmental climate change, economy and technology prospects, geopolitics and governance, territorial and mobility, dynamics, research, education, and innovation. And calculations were extremely interesting. What we missed blatantly was to look at the possibility of UK leaving the EU, proving that social scientists are fallible. So at this point, I would like to raise what I consider a legitimate question. Are we as a research community, together with many policymakers, are actually muddling through education policy research? Or rather, what are we doing well and where are we underperforming today? As a community, in my view, we are quite good at multidisciplinarity. We are not very good at interdisciplinarity. We are able to put together teams that encapsulate several disciplines, but often they continue operating within own silos. For example, there is a quest from the European Union clearly to link EU policy priorities by including the Digital Education Action Plan, the Basic Skills Action Plan, competence-based curricula, ethical AI, and inclusive digital education. So while the policy needs are clearly embedded in interdisciplinarity, in practice, when we do look at projects that are now running, we often see that IT specialists know little about pedagogics and student demographics and learning pathways, while teachers don't know what and how to ask AI to support them. Working across disciplines remains a significant challenge. And I see this conference as an opportunity to meaningfully demonstrate that the interdisciplinary aspects of the global dialogical approach in education and its durable positive effects is not only desirable, but also possible, as was already mentioned at the opening of the conference. A second element at which, as a community, we are quite good at is informing policies. We are not very good at contributing to transforming policies. For example, we have produced lots of evidence about causes and consequences of education inequalities. We have not been as prolific in providing solid evidence on what works and on how we can actually reverse the negative trends. If we look at literatures, there is not so much on that aspect of education. And for policymakers to take up lessons from research and embark in transformative policy initiatives, recommendations coming from research need to be truly knowledge-based. There is a significant quest for evidence, but not any kind of evidence is of same weight. Correlations are no longer sufficient. It is all about quest for causal evidence. And that is a tricky part for social scientists. However, there are examples, and I will give one. In an ongoing research project funded under Horizon, Reverse Ed, we have been systematically looking at strength of evidence from research about capacity to reverse negative trends. And since it is an international project encapsulated some 11 European Union countries, we had to start by forging a joint understanding and definition of what is evidence in education and how we measure it. So we were looking at contextual evidence, at causal evidence, at counterfactual thinking as a form of evidence producing. And we are mapping types of data such as trend studies, international, national, regional, cohort studies, panel studies. We are trying to assess what kind of policy questions can actually be answered by existing data analysis. And above all, we are looking at strength of evidence that interventions actually produce positive outcomes. So the key question for that project, but I would suggest also for this conference, would be what works, how do we know that it works, and why does it work? Moreover, the time frame for impact assessment is also of crucial importance. For example, social impact of interventions can be assessed by test score gains or by the end of the school year results. They can be measured as learning outcomes, as at transition points to the next level, or more comprehensively as lifelong outcomes. The time frame matters. Indeed, there is a significant literature about fade out of interventions in primary and secondary education. According to the forthcoming NSET report, it will be published in a month probably, we observe that the evidence shows that many interventions can improve basic skills in the short run. For example, tutoring and small group remedial instruction produce some of the largest immediate gain, especially when they are intensive, structured, and targeted at pupils with clear learning needs. The most persistent effects, and this is where your conference really is central to the topic, occur when interventions substantially improve children's continuous learning conditions. And this indeed brings me straight to Spain. In a recent peer learning visit to a school at the outskirts of Barcelona, in Terrassa, we found impressive evidence that a dialogical approach implemented for some 20 years shows remarkable results on early learning outcomes for children and durable learning trajectories, and also significantly contributes to a sense of well-being of teachers. So if I'm to give a tone to this conference, I suggest to give prominence in your sessions to interdisciplinary thinking of the dialogical approach, to harvesting evidence of success and discussing strength of evidence, and above all, looking at the sustainability of didactical approaches in terms of lasting social impact on sense of well-being among teachers and persistent better learning outcomes for pupils. What my own takeaway and personal inspiration from the conference program and your approach to areas that you will be addressing is that you are going beyond basic skills such as reading, maths, digital skills, citizen skills, which are undoubtedly fundamental skills, but constitute a rather narrow educational policy framework. You're looking also at creative knowledge and enhancing creativity potentials of pupils and their capacities for musical expression, literature, physical education, plastic and visual arts, just to name a few, which are frequently sidelined in the mainstream debates about education policy. And it is time to really put them back on the priority agenda. So we're hoping that you will find arguments that will justify such a quest. To wrap up, clearly my intention in this introductory setting the stage was not to give a learned overview of theories and key research findings. There is plenty of literature on that. My intention was to highlight needs for research stemming from current policy orientations and the expected trends in the short and medium time frame, based on knowledge about things which we did not do well in the past 20 years or so. And to point out primarily finding opportunities at the EU level that enable transnational research. I think it is highly important that your conference becomes also an opportunity for everybody involved here to participate in this important transfer of knowledge about what you are doing well in your environment and that could potentially be taken up in other educational settings. I would be delighted if, as one of the stakeholders, you continue adding to the list of needs for research in areas that you consider relevant. Because justifying the need for research and the potential benefits and demonstrating those potential benefits is actually the key starting point for comparative analysis. And by the way, it's one of the sub criteria for the evaluation of proposals submitted for the EU funding, but it is above all the measure of success of research, which is expected to produce actionable guidelines. So let's kickstart the dialogical approach. I will end my presentation here, and the floor is open for your reactions. And of course, I remain available for answering questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dragana, for sharing your knowledge with us and for such an inspiring lecture. Antes de dar comienzo, muy rápidamente os voy a dar algunas indicaciones. Las sesiones de comunicaciones presenciales darán comienzo ahora a las 10 y se encuentran en las salas, bueno, en el piso 2, que este es el piso 2, ¿vale?, donde estamos ahora, en la 3, una más, y en la 5. Es verdad que por la tarde también habrá alguna sesión en la sala 1, que obviamente es bajando. La sesión Roundtable, la que se llama Roundtable, mesa redonda, será en la 3FGH. Es el restaurante o la cafetería, pero no os preocupéis, entramos ahí y allí será. En el programa tenéis indicadas también las salas y el número. Por ejemplo, si pone 5B, pues el piso 5. El coffee break tendrá lugar a las 11:30 en el piso 4. Hoy también tendremos la oportunidad de tener tendrá lugar el simposium de sociología, que se hará aquí también en esta sala, donde tendremos pues Sari Hanafi, y tendremos la oportunidad de hablar con él y dialogar y charlar y preguntarle pues sobre el tema del simposium. Además, Sari estará 15 minutos antes, a las 3:15, si no recuerdo mal, en la entrada, donde las inscripciones, 15 minutos antes, porque bueno, estará en venta su libro, y por si queréis alguno comprarlo, si ya lo tenéis, pues él estará dedicando o firmando el libro. Y bueno, por la tarde os recordamos que a las 5 comienzan las sesiones online, las comunicaciones online. A las 6:30 se celebrará la asamblea de distintas áreas y posteriormente a las 7:30 tendrá lugar la asamblea general de AMIE para los socios, o si queréis haceros socios también, pues podréis venir, que será aquí también. Y ya, para acabar, disponemos de wifi abierto que se llama Euskalduna, podéis acceder por ahí, pero bueno, es verdad que en las propias salas también habrá otro wifi por cable para los ponentes, ¿vale? Y también recordaros que tenemos el hashtag, que podéis verlo aquí en las acreditaciones, que es hashtag CIME26, y en las bolsas que os hemos dado también pone el hashtag, por si queréis hacer posts o bueno, en distintas redes sociales. Y ya por último, 2 cosas, y ya me callo. Mañana tendrá lugar la cena del Congreso. Si hay alguno que todavía no se ha apuntado y quiere venir, podéis ir a inscripciones, y si hay algún hueco, pues todavía tal vez estéis a tiempo. Y ya por último, una invitación un poco menos académica, pero igual de importante, a ver si me pueden poner el QR. Vale, como sabéis, aquí en Bilbao y también en Euskadi, que no solo en Bilbao, en mi pueblo también se hace, los jueves solemos hacer pinchopote. Entonces, que hoy por la tarde, bueno, o sea, por la tarde no, por la noche cuando acabe, iremos a la Plaza Nueva, quien quiera y quien podáis, a tomar unos potes, un agua, un mosto, lo que cada uno quiera, y seguir conversando y en un ambiente pues más distendido, ¿no? Será un placer que os unáis. Entonces, por eso hemos organizado este QR, que es un Telegram, que no ponéis ni vuestro número de teléfono ni nada, es un QR, un grupo, y ahí pues iremos dando información, y bueno, pues si queréis uniros, genial, y si no, pues también. Y ahora ya sí, vamos a las sesiones.